Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Namovsky, and today we're talking about Rogers versus Rogers. Now, Alexandra, before we went to commercial break, we were talking about the dual class share structure, and you were explaining what Class B shares are.
Yeah, so the Class B shares, they don't come with any voting rights. So if Rogers decides to change its board, for instance, those Class B shareholders, they'll get invited to a shareholder meeting where they can ask questions, but they won't be able to actually vote on who those directors should be. And in the case of Rogers, more than 97% of the Class A voting shares are actually held within trusts that are controlled by the Rogers family. And so those shares come with 50 votes each, and the Class B shares come with no votes. And those are the widely held shares. So those are the Class B shares are the shares that you might have in your pension or in your mutual fund, or you could own directly as an investor. Whereas the Class A voting shares are generally the vast majority of them are owned by Rogers family members.
So that's interesting, and I'm going to segue to corporate governance. I've been to a lot of different functions. We've had some major functions in Toronto, and I would talk about the book, and people would say, "This is an important book for corporate governance for anybody who wants to be on the board." So, why is corporate governance so important?
Well, corporate governance, while it might sound like something that's kind of dry to the average person, it's very important because corporate governance essentially speaks to how companies are governed and what protocols and processes are in place. And, this essentially dictates the major decisions within corporations that then trickle down to their customers, to other stakeholders, to the broader telecom, in this case, ecosystem, to the economy at large. And so corporate governance is very important. And that's what I try to do through this story, is kind of bring people into the room and show them how Rogers was being governed, and maybe ask some questions about whether this is the right mode of governance. And it's particularly important when you have these situations with Class A and Class B shares, because the Class B shareholders, they don't get to vote on these major decisions. And so it's important for the directors to keep in mind the fact that you do have a large swath of the company that is owned by non-voting shareholders. And are you making decisions with those shareholders in mind?
So before we get into the details, I enjoyed the book, but I'd like you to talk about some of the key characters in this story.
For sure. So the first character that we really encounter is Ted Rogers. He is, of course, the founder of Rogers Communications, and he's spent his whole life essentially trying to bring the Rogers family name back into prominence after his own father, the inventor of the first batteryless radio, died at a very young age, and his mother essentially sells the family business and is left with very little. And so she instills in her son this dogged determination to build this empire, this Rogers empire. And he does so with the help of his wife, Loretta Ann Rogers, who is, of course, the daughter of a British MP and the heiress of the Woolworth department store fortune. And so they come together, and Loretta is a really significant player because she essentially backs his early entry into business. And Ted and Loretta have 4 children. The eldest of them is Lisa Rogers, followed by their first and only son, Edward Rogers. And then we have Melinda Rogers, and the youngest, of course, is Martha Rogers. And, as the company is growing and Ted is getting older, there's all these kinds of questions lingering about succession. Who is going to lead the company when Ted decides to step away or when he passes away? And this is a very significant question for a company like Rogers, where you have this kind of larger than life founder who's got his hands in every aspect of the company. And there's this, running joke that there's no decision at Rogers too small for Ted to make. And so one of the key themes in this book, of course, is when you have a company like that, succession is so important. And what I try to talk about is how the company tries to find its footing in the wake of Ted's passing. And so we see a series of CEO changes in the company, and then, of course, culminating in the conflict that we see in the fall of 2021 over who should lead Rogers going forward.
So don't go away. We'll be right back with more Rogers versus Rogers.